welcome to everybody. Glad you could make it today. This is our first COE Research Colloquium of the semester. Glad that those of you who made it were able to make it. And I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, our only speaker today, Heather Servaty-Seib, who's from Educational Studies. And you can see the title of her talk up here. This relates to her long-standing work, and I'm just going to turn the time over to her. So,
all right.
Heather, it's all
well,
yours.
Thank you very much. I am very glad to have a chance to talk with you today about a project that I've been working on with my research team for a really long time and has really kind of culminated. And what I'm going to be presenting to you is information that has been put into a manuscript that is finally impressed with the Journal of Loss and Trauma. It's been a long time coming, and you'll see that as we go through. It's 3 different studies that I'm going to be talking about with you today that have led to the development of the perceived impact of life event scale. So I'm going to start with a couple of slides and then give you some handouts. I just want to start with some general sort of overview. And then I'm going to actually have you complete the instrument before we go any further. So the background is that I really do have a research program that's focused on death and dying issues, and also on the expansion of that to the application of loss as a broader concept, to really looking and using the concept of loss around a variety of life events. And this is very much connected to the discipline that I'm in, which is counseling psychology, because it has a very normative and life transition and crisis kind of focus. Counseling psychology focuses on those kinds of issues. And the use of a gain-loss kind of framework that we're going to be talking about today is very much connected to coping and also focused on more of an asset strength-based idea and adaptation than it is based on deficits or weaknesses. And I think that will come through as we go through today. So members of my research team were very interested in using this broader concept of loss in their dissertation projects, but there really isn't very good instrumentation related to using the concept of loss in this broader way. So there is some, the empirical grounding behind our approach to this was really connected to looking at the impact of life events, because our idea is that you can use loss as a way to consider life experiences, but also the extent of loss in those events can be helpful in terms of thinking about the impact of them. And there's been a number of ways that people have looked at the impact of life events, and one of those ways has been, just as an example, is the Holmes-Rahe life stress inventory. And I'm going to give that to you. You don't need to fill this one out, but it can just give you a little bit of comparison to the instrument that we developed, that my research team and I developed. As you'll see on the Holmes and Rahe, which is a common approach used in looking at life events, is that each life event here has a score. So regardless of the person, regardless of their particular individual experience with that stressor, you get a score. And one of the key challenges to this kind of approach is how is it that individuals who experience similar life events have very different experiences regarding the impact of those life events. And so this is one way of looking at life events, and you would add up all of the cumulative events you've had, and that would give you some kind of score. Our instrument is really more focused on looking at an individual life event and trying to see it in the complexity that exists within just that single life event, and acknowledging the fact that in terms of a divorce, you can't give one number of 73 and say everyone will have some sort of equal impact in terms of 73. So individuals perceive different gains and losses associated with life events, and that was really the basis for us. The starting point was that if you look at a life event, people are going to identify and indicate a variety of gains and losses that they attribute to that life event. And so that led us to the development of this gain loss framework, and then the development of a measure that really uses that idea to look at impact. And so I'm going to give you the instrument now. And the directions are really pretty self-explanatory, so I'm just going to give you a few minutes to fill it out. And I think this will just give us the base for the rest of the talk today. And do know, as you fill out this instrument, I am absolutely not going to ask you what life event you picked I'm not going to ask you how you answered each of these items, nothing like that. I just want you to see the instrument before you hear a lot more detail about it, how it was developed. So now that you have it and you've thought about it some, it will really help me in my explaining of it to be able to refer back to this is now the final version of what the instrument looks like, but it definitely was not where it started. So the core assumptions of this gain-loss framework that we developed was really that significant life events are associated with perceptions of gains and losses in a variety of life domains, and that the impact of any single life event can be determined by assessing the perception of the gains and losses the individual associates with that life event, and that the perceptions of gain and losses associated with this significant life event will vary based on the specific life domains, so that you would have, as individuals, gains that you would perceive and losses for the same life event, that every life event will have gains and losses. And this is not the way we generally think about life events, and not the message that the world generally gives us about life events as well, that they have this level of complexity and that they're dynamic in this way. We really get much more of a message of either desirable or undesirable. And it really is quite difficult for people when that isn't what they're experiencing, but they continually get that kind of message. So that's part of where we're coming from here. And that the impact of the life event is open to change, because the impact will vary as a result of factors like time, engagement in counseling, of course, we believe. Things that happen in the person's life will be connected to their perceptions of that life event, that it's fluid, which then doesn't help, of course, with the test-retest of the instrument. But we haven't determined that yet. And then the relative level of perceived gains, because you'll see here that higher scores are going to come out as gains in terms of the scaling of the instrument, will be positively associated with other desirable outcomes like well-being, satisfaction, those kinds of things. And so those are the assumptions that we began with as we were developing this instrument, many of which are connected to a variety of different scholarship bases, connected to developmental psychology and the lifespan development approach, definitely connected to counseling psychology, related to a couple of other theories that we're going to be talking about here. But in the manuscript that I wrote up, I was tying together a variety of different disciplines that helped build those core assumptions. So we just didn't come up with them on our own. They're really a collection of ideas from a variety of different fields. So the team chose life events. This is how we started with our item development, based on life events that were highlighted by scholars who have suggested using a concept of loss in a broad way. And then we also looked at the research interests of the research team. If you actually go to PsycInfo and you put in the word loss with just about any life event, you're going to get some scholarship where people have connected this concept of loss to a variety of different life events. And some of those have been more commonly connected to the concept than others. But what happens is that people don't really define the term, and they don't really connect it to, there's actually existing scholarship that argues the need for a psychology of loss, for example. And so we were really pulling life events from that scholarship and looking at them, and we generated a list of losses associated with the life events that are listed here. So the team, there's a number of team members, they all generated lists of losses. They went through scholarship and put together a whole bunch of lists of potential loss areas that were connected to these life events. And so once we did that, we synthesized those lists using a consensual sort of approach. So we had them all together in team. We were looking at how many times does anybody have this, on their lists, and we spread them all out, and we really worked to come up with a synthesized list of losses. It was about 77 items. Then we tried to categorize those 77 items based on Schlossberg's adult transition theory. Schlossberg is a counseling psychologist, and she really talks about how life events are transitions for people, and that there are a variety of changes that happen. On one page in her book, she talks about losses and gains. So we kind of grabbed onto that and said some of these changes that she identifies could be really looked at in this gain-loss sort of way that we were looking at. So we tried to fit the 77 that we came up with underneath the areas of change that she indicated in her adult transition theory: roles, routines, relationships, assumptions of self, and assumptions of the world. And it helped us in our conversation to synthesize things, to have some sort of category, sort of system to be looking at. But then, of course, our question was, when we went through the factor analysis of these items, were they going to come out similar to her categories, which was a question that we had. Oh, and we did have experts review the list and give us feedback, one of which was Schlossberg herself. Then we created and piloted 6 versions of this scale, and this is a little hard to explain because the versions, there were 6. So there were 2 versions of the terminology crossed by 3 versions of the item presentation. So the item presentation that you have in front of you, that won, basically, that was one of the research participants. Let me know which one won, he said. One of the participants in this pilot study is the continuum approach, which has gains on one side and losses on the other side. Hopfall, who was one of our expert reviewers, said, you need to do it as a side-by-side. You need to put the items in the middle, and you need to have a gain 1 to 7 on this side and a loss 1 to 7 on this side, which was the side-by-side version. He said you need to do that because in any of these life domains, someone could indicate a level of gain and a level of loss, not that they were on the same continuum. And we were like, oh, that makes sense. That's even more specificity. And so we thought, okay, let's try that approach. And then the other approach was a full double listing. So the 77 items, what's the extent of gain? And the 77 items, what's the extent of loss? All still back to whatever life event the individuals had chosen. So this is what we did. We piloted, we had about 25 people who did each version. It probably says in here, yeah, 24 to 29 people. This was our participants, about 160 in this pilot process of the versions. You can see we had a really wide age range, which is what we were going for. We went to University Place. We went to another, older adult sort of, we really tried to go out into the community. We also used some classes at Purdue, but that really wasn't our primary target. We did mostly have white and mostly female, which is a limitation of all of what I'm going to be talking with you about. All 3 studies is a significant limitation. But the participants completed hard copies. They returned them through stamped envelopes. And so what we found, and you'll see this was the same on that initial version. We never told people what life event to pick because we were really working for the broadest sort of applicability of this measure as possible. And so these are the variety of the life events that people indicated, all the ones that were 5% or above. And then the majority of people, 60%, indicated that the event was desirable versus undesirable because we hadn't really indicated to them for it to be either one. So we analyzed the data from this pilot study for all 6 versions, and what we found was that participants did not understand the side-by-side. Even though it had more theoretical sort of base and it really fit with our desire to get the most complexity as possible, people just went through and filled out one side. If they put a gain down, they didn't put a loss. And so we really couldn't use that version, even though it was the one that we thought was probably the best. And the one, of course, that Hopfall had said he thought would be the best. The terms gains versus loss and positive, negative change really didn't seem to make much of a difference. We asked people what they thought, and if they thought loss or gain would be better if they'd received the positive and negative change, and they all liked the one they got. And so there wasn't really a great deal of variety. Length was definitely a problem. For the full double listing and for the side-by-side, the people just said it was too long, they couldn't do it. And then the internal consistency for all of them, there was too many items for it to really be different among the 6 versions, but they were all very much the same, which did indicate item redundancy, which is what we were going for overall. And we ended up adding 3 items because we did give them open-ended, what items weren't here that you would have wanted to have seen. And through that process of analyzing those, we added 3: educational achievement, time spent alone, and taking time for self. So the one that won was the format that you have in front of you and the word choice of the gains and losses. Because there wasn't preference by the participants, gain-loss is really where we started. We were doing the positive and negative just to sort of stretch ourselves and to make sure, but that's really where we started this whole thing. So then we're looking at psychometrically evaluating the instrument. And so we wanted to look at the internal structure. Does the data fit the categories of gain and loss or change for Schlossberg's theory? If not, do they hold together in another meaningful kind of way? Definitely we needed item reduction, because now we have 80 items because we added the 3 to the 77. And then are there underlying assumptions are the underlying assumptions supported? So is there a positive association between gains and the time since the event? And are there losses in some life domains and gains in the other in connection with the same life event, which was part of what we were looking for? And then, of course, phase 2 was a confirmatory factor analysis, which is also I will talk with you about. So if we go through phase 1, we used faculty and staff from a large Midwest university, not Purdue. Purdue actually is very difficult to get access to faculty and staff in doing research. Other institutions, it's much more possible. And so it was an institution where one of our students was completing her internship, and she was able to get connected, and we were able to get access that way. So we had almost 500 participants who had completed the whole instrument, and where they hadn't skipped so much that we weren't able to include them. And again, very wide age range, which is what we were going for. We had a really difficult time getting samples for this study, which is part of why it took so long to move through this whole process. Because we weren't looking for specific individuals with specific life events, and we weren't looking for a specific developmental period. We were looking for the broadest sample that we could get, and you would think that would be the easiest to get, but it isn't. It's really not. It was very difficult to sort of get the word out there and find a sample that was this broad, and even this one's clearly biased, as you'll see by the demographics, but it's a starting point for the instrument. So we divided the sample in half to be able to use one for phase 1 for the exploratory and the other half for phase 2 of the confirmatory factor analysis. So the participants were recruited through email, and they completed an online version of the piles, all very similar to the one that you just did, but just a lot longer with a lot more items. And they also completed the benefit finding scale, which is a scale that was developed in the field of breast cancer research. And what they were really looking at is, can you identify any benefits to this life event? And then, of course, we changed it to be more broad. We asked, can you identify any benefits to this life event? So that was one where we expected a positive correlation. And then we also used the impact of life event scale, which is a very commonly used instrument to assess the impact of life events, but it's focused on actually the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's very extreme. So it's related to the piles, but when we expected it to be negatively correlated, since higher scores on the piles are the gains, but it's also not normative. Like, people use it oftentimes in a normative way, but the items are all based on the criteria for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So related, but we expected moderate, not a whole lot of overlap. And then we use the Marlowe-Crown, which is an assessment of social desirability, to see, are people just responding the way they think people want them to respond to the instrument. So if you experience a death loss, it should all be loss. And if you experience the birth of a child, it should be all gain. Which is what society would say to us. So here are the participants in the first group. There are the demographics. The age range here is very similar to the overall and very similar to the second half of the data. Very highly educated sample. And very female, very white, and very much employed. So these are the common death losses. Very similar to the pilot study. There's some variability, but there's a lot of consistency in the life events that people pick. And half of them indicated the event was desirable versus undesirable. So we really have a clear balance between that. More so even than the pilot study. But again, they picked their life event. We didn't indicate it to them. So the analysis suggested, this actually was me. This wasn't the team anymore. This was me. So I looked at the statistical analyses, and it really suggested sort of 5 subgroupings of the items. And I'm talking about exploratory factor analysis now. I'm using an example from a very broad presentation that I did, so I didn't talk a lot about the very specific stats in here, although with the confirmatory I did that a little bit because I added that this week. Because it's been done more recently. So there were 6 items that were eliminated because they had low commonalities, which means they didn't relate to any of the other items. So those were deleted even before I did any kind of analyses. And then the items were retained if they were strongly associated with one of the factors and minimally associated with the other. So factor analysis is really taking a group of these items and saying, are there reasonable ways that subgroups of these items hold together? That people responded in such a way that you could subgroup them. That's really what factor analysis is doing. And so I used a very specific kind of extraction and rotation to do that in terms of the statistical approach. And when push came to shove, there were really 4 factors that held together. And these 4 factors emerged as most appropriate in terms of the statistical criteria, which was they had to load at least 0.52 on that factor and less than 0.32 on any of the others. And so they had to have pretty strong loading in their subgrouping and lower loadings in the others. And that really ended up with 29 items. The factors also had to have at least 3 items on them, which is another rule of thumb when you're doing factor analysis. If 2 items out of 80 hold together, that's not enough. And so 3 is also not that great, which you'll see, but is better and kind of the general rule that people use. So the 29 items, which are the ones that are on the version that you did, here are, I'm going to go through each of the factors. The first one is existential gains and losses. And so all these items you saw when you were looking at the piles today, and they really have to do with existential theory. If you look at this and you know about theoretical sort of approaches or even existential philosophy, all of these items really kind of hold together around how do I see life, hope, purpose, belongingness, a sense of connection versus isolation. All of those things are connected to existentialism. So that's what I called it. The second factor in this exploratory was the weakest one, and you can see the internal consistency was only 0.70, which is really kind of the cutoff. And the internal consistency is how well the items seem to be responded to the same. Like how often do participants respond to these 3 items in a similar sort of way? And the higher, the more that is. So 0.7 is kind of a cutoff where it's sort of like, well, it's okay. But the others are all a good bit higher. And you can see it was hard to name this one because it's time with friends, time with colleagues, and exercise. And I was like, this is discretionary time. This is time that you can sort of pick what you want to do with. And I do think it fell out that way in terms of the life events and how people scored across them. But you'll see what happens with this one in phase 2 of the data analysis process. So the third factor was romantic relationship gains, and so here are, and actually I did call it, when I had more room, romantic sexual relationship gains and losses, because you can see there's sexual items and then just general romantic kind of partner sort of items that loaded here, and much better internal consistency with the 0.92. And then the fourth one had to do with career and employment, and you can see those items there. So finances, material possessions, education, employment, financial security, those kinds of things, which also held together quite well. So additional results that came from this phase 1 is that the 4 factors that did emerge were moderately associated with one another. And what that says is it makes sense that they're all on the same scale, and yet they're not completely redundant of one another, which was part of what I was looking for. That's a really good result for me, because I'm saying, okay, this means that something different is being tapped by each of these sub-factors. And then the means, all, if you look at your scaling, okay, they're all either right at 4 or a little above it. So that's on the gain side in terms of the means, because this is the overall mean for each factor. And so part of that, I think, is that some of the life events were very far in the past. And our theoretical assumption, was that the further away from the life event, the more gains you would perceive. So it makes sense here that all of these means are on the positive side when all of the life events tended to be a little bit further back for people in their past. Which is still, there's so much more research to be done as I think about this instrument. So So the time since the event was consistently and positively associated with gains across all 4 domains. So the further people were away, the more they identified gains. Higher gains for participants with desirable versus undesirable events, which makes very good sense, but is still just another check of whether or not the instrument is performing the way that we expected it to. Now this one I don't know what to do with, so I always, when I talk about this instrument, I just throw it out because I don't know what to do with it. Males were more likely than females to report gains, regardless of the life event, in existential and romantic relationships, but not in discretionary time or career and employment. And I don't know what to do with that, so maybe we can talk about it at the end. But I don't know, it was interesting. There's a variety of diversity questions that can be answered, I think, or looked at or explored with this instrument now that it exists. So here are some additional results. Birth of a child was the highest and higher than death, illness of self, and illness of other in terms of existential gains. So the birth of a child, you have all those existential things sort of rising. Death was the lowest and lower than the others. And so these, I'm really pointing out the statistically significant differences that existed for each of these specific domains. Discretionary time, divorce was the highest in terms of gains. Gains in discretionary time, divorce was the highest. And higher than illness of a child, or illness of other, birth of a child, and death. And then look at this one. Romantic relationship gains. Marriage was the highest and higher than all the others except divorce, because divorce was right up there next to it. So divorce also had high gains in romantic relationship, almost similar, very similar actually, to marriage. This is why this instrument needs to exist, for me, is that people make assumptions about life events and how they're experienced. And then career and employment. Career and education change is highest and higher than illness of self, illness of others, death, and birth of a child. Marriage higher than many, and divorce also higher than some of the others in terms of those career and employment gains. So the data did not fit the categories of gains and loss that Schlossberg laid out. There wasn't routines, roles, assumptions of the world, assumptions of self, but there was some overlap because there was a relationship one, and here there was a romantic, specifically, and sexual. And the existential domain here really does kind of connect to the assumptions of the world and the assumptions of the self. There's some assumption kinds of things that connect with the existential, but not exactly. There's just some. The item reduction from 80 down to 29 is pretty darn good. But there's some grief there to lose some items that would be important to certain life events, but that just got cut out because they didn't have enough similarity across all of them. But we were working very specifically to try to get what worked overall. So that has its pros and cons. So the factors were moderately correlated with one another. There were positive associations between gains in all the life domains and the time since the life event. And, desirable was higher on gains than undesirable life events. And the birth of a child was highest in existential and one of the very lowest in terms of discretionary time. Which I had a child just before beginning this project and a child in the midst of this project. And that was a little confirming to me. Because you don't often get that message of losses that you might experience when you have the birth of a child. It's wrong, somehow, to be able to vocalize and say there are some losses here. And I think also very similar, there are death losses that involve certain gain elements to them. And it's difficult for people to be able to talk about those. There are many death losses where there's elements of relief to them. And it's normative. To have those kinds of experiences, but difficult just for people to be able to discuss in general. So phase 2 is the confirmatory factor analysis, and we use the other half of the data. And we were really looking at testing the 4-factor that came out from the exploratory, and then a 3-factor, because that discretionary time with only the 3 items, not so strong. And so I wanted to try it without that factor 2 to see if the data would fit that structure better. And then, of course, looking to see if putting all the items, all 29 of them, back in would be a better fit for the data than trying to do the subscores, which, of course, I didn't want because I wanted to show the specificity. So then this is where we really use the responses to those other instruments to be able to see if scores on the piles related in expected ways to benefit finding and impact and didn't relate to social desirability. We were not wanting, of course, correlations there. So here are the demographics, very similar again. Very white, very employed, very female. Similar age range and also similar education level. Common life events, very similar. Little bit of shifting, but again, this is the same big sample that was divided in two, so it's good that they're not different. They weren't statistically different from one another on any of these variables. And then just over half is basically the same. Had desirable versus undesirable life event. And you'll notice that that's asked at the end, right? The question about desirable and undesirable, and that's exactly the same way that it was asked when we did the data collection.
You have illness of self on there twice.
Oh, well, one needed to be illness of other. Okay. So I can't remember which one it was. I can't remember. Sorry about that. It is an important distinction, actually, because the illness of self, the first one is actually, I do know, the illness of self had been consistently higher in terms of gains than the illness of others, because people are more able to identify the gains. And I have a little bit of a story related to that as we move through here. So it is other that should be at the end. Thanks. So this is the comparison in terms of the fit indices of the three. This first one is just total comparison, that there's no connection between any of them, that none of them fit together at all. And this one is that they all fit on one factor, and this is that they fit on the 4, and this is that they fit on the 3. So the 3 came out a little bit better than the 4, but not really. So the way I talk about it in the article and the way I think about it is that I'm still going to keep all 29 of them on here. And then if people want to use this measure, they can decide, are they going to use the discretionary subscale or not, or do they want to retest to see if the discretionary works better with other samples. So the version that I'm going to send out to people of this instrument, that I have actually, which I can also share, is this 29 item version. So. And this is the structure of it. This is really small. I know that it is, but I just had to cut and paste it. I didn't know how else to do it. So this just shows how each of the items loaded on the 3, the career, the romantic, and the existential in the confirmatory factor analysis. And so the ranges are pretty good. The lowest was 0.40 in terms of access to employment opportunities on career. But otherwise, it's very nice connection between each of these items and the domains that they're associated with. These are how the correlations came out. So this is the benefit finding scale. Positive associations among all 3 of them in the way that we anticipated, and negative, sort of moderate to low sort of correlations and with the impact of life event scale, which is again the one that measures the post-traumatic stress kind of symptoms. And then not significant correlations with social desirability. So this is just how we wanted it to come out, which is very encouraging. So the 3 or 4 factors may be useful. And it came out moderately associated with similar constructs and not associated with social desirability. I think we need to check out the internal structure with diverse samples, absolutely. I think there's a lot of question about that in terms of different life events, all different levels of diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, male, female. I mean, I had more females here in these samples, but it wasn't as bad as some psychology research is in terms of the overdominance of females, because females do tend to volunteer more for research. I know we find here at Purdue, when the students do research and they send it out to the student body, it gets sent out to more men, and they still get more female responses because there's just more men students here, but the response rate is lower from men, so it works out that it's more even than it might be on other campuses. But I actually had one of my team members recently use the piles. It was Karen, who used it in her 619 project, and she used all 80 items with a sample of college students. So a very, smaller sort of range in terms of age, and she specifically asked them to identify gains and losses associated with their transition to college. And so she used it very differently. And she did another exploratory factor analysis of the 80 items with that more specified sample, and she found a different structure. And I wasn't concerned about that. I was just curious about it, and it's very interesting. She actually found, which I hypothesized at the end of this manuscript, was a friendship scale didn't come out here. And I was very surprised by that, because there's a lot of friendship items in that 80. There was a lot. Only one of them loaded here on the discretionary time. But there was a lot. And I had said in the article, I bet you if you used only college students, you would get a friendship sample. And you would get a friendship subscale, and she found that. She also found that the career employment didn't emerge because they're all in the process of exploration. So why would that emerge for that sample? And it didn't. Now, the romantic came out almost identical, and the existential came out, but it had a little bit different flavor to it because it was connected to the future and issues about the future, and also had some questions in it about, or some items in it about cognitive ability. And so it was very much, it made good sense the way that it had a different flavor to it because of the students, because of them being college students versus all adults who are already employed. So that kind of thing I'm very interested in to see how that works out. And she'll probably use that version in her dissertation now that she did it the way she did. There's also been past student research that's used different versions of the piles, because I said this has been in process. So I had a student that used a version of it looking at parental divorce of college students, and he found that scores on the piles, which higher are the gains, was positively associated with hardiness in the experience of parental divorce, and also positively associated with a concept that's called post-traumatic growth, which is also connected to the benefit finding. It's very similar. And so the piles was operating very much as we would anticipate in that study as well. I had a student who used it in the alcoholism recovery process, and she was looking at AA involvement. And she found that individuals who were more involved in AA reported more gains in their recovery process. Reported more gains, actually, let me say that. And then actually showed more indication of recovery. Like, she used multidimensional measures of all of those things. But the gains, and what she hypothesized, is that what AA does, it helps people to identify more gains and less losses in their recovery process. And I absolutely believe that. And her study really showed that that really could be the case. She was very focused on alcohol issues. We also did a couple manuscripts really looking at AA from the perspective of mourning. And so we related it to a couple current sort of grief and mourning theories, and looked at the 12 steps and aligned them with grief and bereavement theories. Totally neat. Those are published in the Alcoholism Treatment Quarterly. And then I had a student use it with Indian students who were studying in the United States for the first time. And she found a positive association between gains on the piles and acculturation, specifically integration. So the more students were able to remain connected to their country of origin, their culture of origin, and also be connected to the United States culture, the more gains that they perceive. And it's not causal, but it's, still the idea that those things are going together. And as a clinician, what that means is you could talk very directly with them about gains. And if you do, you might be able to help them in the acculturation process. That's how I interpret it. It's not causal, and yet there's an association there that could be very useful in treatment. There's a lot of other ideas, and we can talk about some of those. There's a need for longitudinal research designs also. I want to see how the pile shifts over time in therapy. I want to see, because clients often come in identifying specific stressors. And even though in the course of therapy we know many other things arise, they still come in saying, I'm trying to cope with this. And I think that therapy really does help people weigh the gains and losses. I remember doing a talk at Back to Campus, Back to Class. What is it called?
Yeah, Back to Class.
Back to Class. And it's a group of individuals who give to Purdue and come back to campus, and it's a really thank you kind of event for them for being involved and for. And I did a talk, used part of this in a talk to them, and some man in the back, I had made some comment about saying that as a psychologist I didn't give advice. And he said, well, what do you do then? And I said, well, actually, I think I do almost the opposite of that. because advice is about narrowing and telling people this is what you must or should do. As a psychologist, my job is to help people see their lives in a more complex way, to be able to see the variety of reactions, to be able to accept the complexity of what's happening for them, rather than narrowing it for them and telling them what they must do. And he was like, whoa, I don't know. He didn't like my response. But the piles fits into all of that, because it is about helping people to raise awareness about the complexity. The concept of loss is also approachable and non-pathological. You can talk to people about this. People love this, actually. I mean, yeah, I did lose that. You're right. It's like this acknowledgement of it's not a single life event that we experience. It's multiple losses and potentially multiple gains that are connected. Clients often present with dichotomous views of life events, and they get that message from society. I believe that the piles can help create a shared understanding of others' experiences, which is a critical issue in counseling, is to help the clients to have a sense that you're with them, that you understand how they see what's happening in their life. And I see this working not just as a research tool, but as a tool where you might take it into a session and you might actually walk through it with a client and talk about how they're responding and be able to hear from them in a dialogue kind of way what it's like to even think about their life experience in this gain-loss kind of way. I also think for couples and other families, when I did that back to class event, I had a really big group. It was like 90 people or something. And they all did the measure just like you did today. And I didn't realize this, but there were, of course, a number of couples that were in the audience. And that night, we had an event where it was just like a social kind of cocktail hour. And I had 3 different couples come up to me and say, in your talk, we picked the same life event and we didn't realize it. And we filled it out individually. And then over lunch, we compared our response, or over dinner, we compared our responses. And they were very different from one another. And that was really helpful to us. And I was like, wow, that's so great. And one of the couples it was a woman who actually came up and talked to me, and she said that they had both put down her recent diagnosis of Parkinson's. And what was different in their responses is that she had put down some gains. And he had put down none. And so she was able to talk with him about the gains that she was experiencing in knowing, that she had limited time and knowing what was coming and being able to appreciate relationships more. And she was able to talk with him about that. And she says, how many copies can I have? Because I want to give this to everybody in my family. And I also think assessing gains versus losses with the idea of using gains to assist in some of the loss areas could be possible too. Maybe it is some kind of assessment for some clients of where their strengths lie in connection to a certain life event. And then I do think it's a possible tool for tracking impact of different interventions and things like that. So that's it. All right.
We have some time for questions.
Still processing.
I also have, which is, I just have a lot of these and extra, so that's what I'm going to give them to you. This is a brochure that a couple of my students put together on the piles and the gain-loss approach for the Cancer Culture and Community event last year. It's an event that's done through through Purdue, actually, and done in the community. And one of my students who helped develop this actually is a cancer survivor. And she had suggested this. She had suggested, I think we should talk about the piles and the gain-loss approach at this event, and we could put together some information. And have copies of the instrument as well, but have this brochure to talk about how it might be possible to see gains and losses. The event wasn't that well attended, so we have a lot of copies of this brochure. But it is an applied example.
Yeah. What are all these numbers of the...
Those are the items. Yeah, those are the item numbers. And it should correspond to the version that you have, because that's the version that we get. So that gives you a sense then, actually that tells you, the numbering and how you would categorize each item into its factors. So I had a agency contact me that does a lot of work with grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. And I had written a chapter on that using the gain loss sort of framework, but before the piles was really in any sort of shape. Just presenting the assumptions and just general categories, even from Schlossberg's sort of approach. And they asked for copies of the document that contains the piles, just the electronic version, because they wanted to use it with some of their clients, like even some of their groups. Because that's an interesting life experience that definitely has gains and losses. I mean, where people want to be able to be helpful in the development of their grandchildren, but they had plans of what their life would look like. And those plans are very different now when they're in a position of caring. And when they're caring for their grandchildren, it meant there was a need for them to have to care for their grandchildren, which then connects to whatever the stressors were that led to that. So, yeah.
I was surprised when I filled out the form how many things I was checking as no change.
As no change. Yeah.
Is that typical, or wasn't particularly a positive life experience, but it's just like, well, there just wasn't any change in this area.
Yeah, and I think that's quite possible. I think it's going to depend on the life event. And I think it might also prove the point in terms of someone else who experienced that life event might respond very differently in terms of some of those items. But I also think there are domains that are just not tapped here. I mean, there were items on the piles that had to do, on the 80 item, that had to do with physiological functioning. And I thought for sure that those would sort of hold together in some sort of, I think we called it psychophysio functioning. So it was like sleeping, eating, things like that. And that did not come out overall in terms of the exploratory factor analysis. So friendship didn't come out, that didn't come out, and I had anticipated it too. So, I mean, the idea here is that this was sort of these were the items that were similar across all the life events that this sample had indicated. And they were responded similarly enough by all of those individuals that they rose in terms of the factor analysis. So there's going to be areas that aren't included. And then it also has to do with specificity of your experience, I think. So I often have people, when they do it, say, this was a completely undesirable life event, and I have indicated gains here, and I don't know what to do with that. And I say, well, that's part of what this is about, is that, I want to yell from the mountaintop. Life events are not unidimensional. And the more you can be patient and accepting and kind to yourself in the uniqueness of your response to whatever the life event is that you're focused on, the better it's going to be for you. Because we are very complicated. We're very complicated beings. And we don't see things, we don't experience things that way. Even though as a society we want them to be that simple, they are not that simple. So
I think that's what I find so fascinating is the society perception of things, like working with hospice patients.
Right.
And you immediately picture this doom and gloom thing, but lots of the work that I've done with hospice patients is just amazing. I mean, there's so many positives they see, and they have a different perception of what's going to be important in life,
That's right.
And I just think that's really interesting.
I think it is too. And I think it applies to so many different things. Of course, I'm biased. I say the phrase all the time, which these are two students in the Counseling Psych program, and I'll always be throwing out gains and losses. We were talking at supervision last night, and all the students are struggling with building relationships with new supervisors. And they're like, gains and losses. I'm missing some of the supervision I had before, but I'm gaining different elements of it. The transition out of college.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody, the the message that undergraduate students get is, hooray, wonderful for you, you're graduating. And they are grieving the setting, they're grieving their friendships, they're grieving a structure that they'd become familiar with, the routine, all kinds of elements of the college experience. I mean, surely there's gains, and they can identify those, but they don't get a lot of recognition of the losses that they experience.
And as an advisor, you find a lot of times that the students will stay an extra semester because
they got to grieve.
I take a couple of graduate courses, and it's kind of, it's not that they're that in to get in the master's, they're just still transitioning to, I'm going to have to be an adult now and get a job and move. And
Yep. It's too many losses.
Yeah.
We could use the piles.
It's really
I think we could. And we would be able to see it. Yep.
So do you anticipate making this available broadly?
Yes. Actually, I was just saying to Bob that when we put up the video, I think it's fine. We just put the piles up there too. I mean, that's the way I'm approaching it. I send it to whoever asks me for it. So.
Good.
Great. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
coming.